Have you ever rehearsed a conversation in your head only to never actually have it? Welcome to If I Could Say One More Thing, a podcast about unfinished conversations, second chances, and the quiet moments that continue living inside us long after they've passed. Each episode begins with an original audio story inspired by a real emotional experience, followed by a conversation with the person who asked me to tell it. I'm Andrea Applewick, and sometimes the hardest thing in the world is simply knowing how to begin. Today's story is about two brothers who haven't spoken in 12 years. Not because of one terrible fight, not because they stopped caring, but because time has a way of hardening around silence, especially when neither person knows how to begin again. Luke stayed in Trieste, and Matthew built a life in London. They grew up speaking English together, the language of their British father, and in some ways, the language they used to avoid saying certain things too directly. What unfolds is not a dramatic reconciliation. It's something quieter. A conversation between two men trying to find their way back to each other without entirely knowing how. This is The Call He Almost Didn't Answer. Luke was standing in front of his open refrigerator when the phone rang. He had already forgotten what he was looking for. This happened more than he'd like to admit. The standing, the staring, the vague sense that he had had a reason for being there. His doctor had suggested stress. Luke suspected the hour. There was something about early evening in July, the heat still sitting in the walls, the day refusing to end, that made even the simplest intentions dissolve before they became actions. The light spilled into the kitchen, catching the edge of the counter, the corner of a glass he hadn't moved since morning. Outside, Trieste was giving its usual early evening performance. Quiet, a little wind off the sea, nothing urgent. The house held the kind of silence he had stopped fighting a while ago, which was either inner peace or mild defeat. He had made peace with not knowing which. The phone kept ringing. The number wasn't saved. Not unknown, just unfamiliar in a way that felt as if it might matter. He considered letting it go. He was good at that, letting things go. Over the years, he had developed a remarkably sophisticated internal bureaucracy for deferring whatever made him uncomfortable, filing things under not yet, needs more thought, or, in cases of particular emotional complexity, leaving them open in a tab he never quite got around to closing. There are calls you ignore because you're busy. And then there are calls you ignore because you're not. He picked it up. Hello? A small delay followed. Not technical. Human. Hi. Luke straightened slightly, as if posture might help. He was distantly aware that he was still holding a container of leftover something, and that this was not how he had imagined any significant moment in his life going. Hi, Sorry, this is? It's Matthew. He didn't move. The kitchen seemed to pause around him, as if the room itself had recognized the name before he had. Oh, Luke said, softer than he meant to. Then after a beat, hey. Matthew sounded older, or maybe only more careful. Luke couldn't tell which. Somehow, not knowing felt like information. I didn't have your number saved, he said, which was true, and not even close to what he meant. He meant something more along the lines of, I've thought about you, or I'm sorry it's been so long, or possibly just, hello, I am a person with feelings and no operating manual. But what came out was the thing about the number. Even as he said it, Luke knew it was completely the wrong sentence. Yeah, Matthew said. I figured. No accusation, just fact. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. Luke let out a breath, somewhere between a laugh and an admission. I almost didn't. He leaned against the counter, still holding the fridge door open. The kitchen was warm. The whole flat was warm. Had been warm since May, in the way Italian apartments commit to a season completely without apology. The cold coming off the fridge was the only relief available, and he was choosing not to take it. This, he recognized, was a metaphor. He was annoyed by how apt it was. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, everything's fine. A pause. I was going through some old emails. Your contact was there, so I thought I'd... Matthew let the sentence disappear. Luke turned the container in his hand. He thought briefly about saying, I'm glad you did. Simple words, completely sincere, medically harmless. He considered this option for approximately 4 seconds, then discarded it entirely. Call me out of administrative nostalgia, he said instead. A small laugh came through the line, real this time. Yeah, Matthew said, exactly that. The air eased a little. Not completely. Enough. They talked the way men do when they're warming up to something they haven't named yet. Which is to say, they talked about everything except the thing. They spoke about London. Same flat, same terrible heating, still no air conditioning, which Matthew mentioned with the resigned affection of someone describing a difficult relative he had chosen not to cut off. Apparently, the entire city had decided that suffering through another 30-degree summer, scorching by London standards, was a form of character building, and Matthew had been building character for 6 weeks straight. Luke was still in Trieste. Someone has to keep the sea company, he said. Matthew's quiet laugh replied before his words did. That sounds like an excuse. It's one of my better ones. Then they spoke about work. Emails, meetings, more emails pretending to be meetings. Luke said he thought that was international at this point. Matthew confirmed it, and for a moment, they were simply two people who had grown up, gotten jobs, and occasionally had to attend things that could have been emails. It was almost relaxing, being ordinary together. Luke hadn't realized how much he missed that feeling, the easiness of someone who knew him before he had become responsible for explaining himself. Then they spoke about the house, what it smelled like now, less aftershave, more wood, coffee, time. It had been their parents' house until it wasn't anymore, and then it became the kind of thing families negotiate around the edges of grief. Luke had stayed. He was the older one. At the time, it had seemed like the thing the older one does. He wasn't always sure he had been right. "That's probably better," Matthew said. "Debatable," Luke replied. He had actually liked their father's aftershave, and the current arrangement, one man, one house, the permanent faint scent of solitude, sounded more romantic when he described it to other people than it felt in daily practice. In practice, it almost smelled like forgotten coffee and rooms that only one person ever opened the windows in. "Mom said you had done most of it yourself," Matthew added. That was how it still worked. Their mother, as the quiet relay station between them, passing information in both directions with careful neutrality, never editorializing, never saying, "Why don't you just call him?" She had learned over the years that the most effective thing she could do was mention things and leave the rest alone. They talked about the neighbors. Luke's upstairs neighbor seemed to rearrange furniture exclusively between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. Luke had never once confronted him because he was, at his core, a man who found conflict significantly more exhausting than insomnia. Matthew laughed at that. It was the kind of laugh that meant, "You haven't changed." Luke heard it as a compliment, though he wasn't entirely sure it was meant as one. Then they spoke about the table. That heavy, immovable table that had outlasted every other piece of furniture, 3 arguments, 1 attempted reorganization of the kitchen, and at least 2 people who had reasonably suggested that it was too large for the space. Luke had kept it. He wasn't entirely sure why. It was heavier than most of his decisions, which was either the problem or the point. "We used to sit there for hours," Matthew said. Luke remembered one night in particular. The 2 of them at opposite ends, a bottle between them, the windows open and the night noise drifting up, talking until it was late enough for the streets to go quiet. Neither had noticed the time passing. They were 20-something and believed that was simply how nights worked. He remembered other nights, too, earlier ones, when they were boys and their father sat at the head of the table and the room seemed enormous. It didn't seem enormous anymore. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He didn't say any of this. He only said, "Yeah." Then Matthew said quietly, "I was in Trieste last month." Luke went still. "Oh." "Work thing. Something quick." A beat. I drove past the house. Luke looked toward the hallway as if he might suddenly see the street from there, which was not how hallways worked, but the impulse came anyway. You did? Yeah. A soft exhale. Didn't stop. Drove past. Luke let the image settle. Matthew's car slowing on the via. The house lit or dark. Neither of them there. Both of them somehow present. You could have come by, Luke said. Yeah. A pause. I thought about it. Why didn't you? Matthew took his time. I didn't know what I'd say. Luke closed his eyes for a moment. A recognition moved through him. Not pain exactly. More like finally understanding the shape of it. Two people could want the same thing badly enough to prevent it from happening. It wasn't a character flaw. It was merely an efficient system for producing regret. Well, I could have called you too, Luke said. It came out before he had decided to offer it. Yeah. More than once, actually. He heard that land. He hadn't meant to say more than once. That was the kind of honesty that arrived without permission, bypassing every sensible checkpoint he had installed over the years. Same, Matthew said. They had both been waiting for the other one to go first. That was the truth of it. Not because they didn't care, because they cared too much to risk getting it wrong. 12 years is a long time to protect something by avoiding it. It is also, objectively, a long time. Luke had known this for most of those 12 years in the vague way you know a thing you've decided not to address. Always in the corner of your vision, patient, unwilling to fully disappear. Do you ever think about back then? Matthew asked. Sometimes. I don't even remember what we argued about. Brothers always argue about the wrong thing, Luke said. It's practically tradition. What was it actually about then? Luke shifted his weight. I think we stopped. And then stopping became the thing. And then too much time passed to unstop it without making it a whole... He searched for the next word. Event. A beat. That's a bit disappointing, Matthew said. Yeah, we've always had a talent for underwhelming conclusions. They both laughed. Not loudly, without hesitation. The laugh of two people who recognize themselves in the same unflattering description and find, to their surprise, comfort there. I didn't call because I didn't know how to start, Matthew said. You just did. A pause. Softer now. Yeah, Matthew said. I guess I did. So, Luke asked, what now? I don't know. We don't have to decide anything. Luke nodded to himself. This was the most appealing thing anyone had said to him in recent memory. The freedom of not having to conclude something, of being allowed to remain in the middle. But maybe next time it won't take... Matthew stopped himself. Luke finished it. 12 years? Yeah. A breath. That. After they hung up, Luke stood in the kitchen for a while. He thought about the 12 years, about the emails Matthew had been sorting through, the particular archaeology of an old inbox, the way you open a folder untouched for years and find names that once belonged to your daily life, entire chapters reduced to a thread, a timestamp, a number you're no longer sure will work. He thought about how strange it is, the way people don't so much drift apart as stop doing the thing that kept them connected. No decision, no declaration, only a gradual mutual permission to let time do the work neither person wanted to do. And then, one day, you're sitting in a kitchen in Trieste holding unidentified leftovers, and 12 years have passed, and someone is calling from a number you no longer have saved. He thought about Matthew driving past the house, slowing down, not stopping, sitting somewhere on that street, engine running, doing the math on whether this was the moment, and deciding, as Luke had decided 100 times from the other direction, that it wasn't. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much, and he hadn't prepared anything, and you can't simply show up at someone's door after 12 years with nothing in your hands. You need something to say, something that explains the silence without making it larger than it already is. Something that sounds like a beginning rather than an apology. Matthew hadn't found that sentence. Neither had Luke. And yet, here they were. He thought about all the times he had picked up his phone with full intention and put it down again. Because the moment wasn't right. Because he wasn't ready. Because he didn't know what he would say. Which, he understood now, was a longer way of saying he was afraid. The size of what he felt had made him careful in a way that looked, from the outside, exactly like indifference. This was probably the central misunderstanding of his entire emotional life. And he was 35 years old before a phone call he nearly didn't answer helped him see it clearly. He wasn't sure what to do with that. So he filed it under things to think about later, which was where he kept most of the important stuff. Then he reached out and closed the fridge. The sound it made, a soft, definitive clink, filled the room briefly, then faded. He wasn't sure what had been resolved, but something had changed. The way the most important things do, quietly, without announcement, and only clear in the moment after. He put the container back. he still didn't know what was in it. How much time can pass before reaching out to someone begins to feel impossible? And at what point does silence stop feeling temporary and start becoming part of the relationship itself? As always, some names, locations, and identifying details have been modified for privacy. But the emotional truth of this story comes from the experience shared with me by the person you are about to hear from. Today, that person is Luke. In our conversation, we talk about emotional hesitation, male loneliness, the fear of saying the wrong thing, and the strange way silence can begin to resemble indifference, even when it's actually coming from care. We also talk about language, identity, and how sometimes the people who know us best are also the people we struggle most to speak honestly with. Here's my conversation with Luke. Luke, when your phone rang that evening and you saw a number you didn't recognize, what made you answer it?
I'm not sure, actually. I almost didn't. It wasn't urgent or anything, just a number. But it didn't feel completely random either. Like, sometimes you see something and you think, there's probably a reason for this, even if you don't know what it is. And I think I didn't want to miss it. Which is a strange thing to say about a phone call. But yeah, that's probably it.
And when you heard his voice and realized it was your brother, what happened in that moment?
It was immediate. Not in a big way, just I knew it was him. Which is strange because it had been, 12 years? But there wasn't any doubt. And then everything else sort of caught up. I think I felt not shock, more like recognition. Like nothing had changed, and at the same time, everything had. And I realized I hadn't forgotten him at all.
You know, as I was writing your story, it felt like this wasn't the first time you had thought about reaching out. What held you back before?
It sounds simple when you say it like that. Just call in. But it never felt simple. I would pick up the phone and then I think, okay, what am I actually going to say? And I didn't have an answer. And then it starts to feel, I don't know, awkward, forced, like you need to have something prepared. And I didn't want it to be wrong.
Wrong in what way?
Like too much or not enough, you know? If you say too much, it becomes a whole thing. If you say too little, then why did you even call? So I think I was waiting for the right version of the conversation, which never arrived.
Did the silence between you ever feel like a decision, or did it just happen?
It definitely didn't feel like a decision. That's the strange part. If you had asked me, I would have said, no, of course not. We just haven't spoken. But now I think not doing something repeatedly is also a decision. It just doesn't feel like one.
Was there ever a moment where you almost reached out and didn't?
Yeah, a lot of times, actually. More than I probably want to admit. Sometimes it was something small, like seeing something that reminded me of him, or hearing someone mention London. And I'd think, okay, I'll send a message. And then I put the phone down again.
What happened in that moment?
I think I talked myself out of it. Not in a big way, just small things like it's been too long, or it'll be weird, or he's probably busy. All very reasonable. That's the problem, I think. It all sounds reasonable.
Was there something you wanted to say to him that you couldn't quite find the words for?
Yeah. I mean, nothing big. It's not like I have some speech in my head. It was more just hi. But even that felt like it needed context or an explanation. And then once you start thinking about explaining 12 years, you don't send the message.
What does your relationship with your brother represent for you that other relationships don't?
That's a difficult question. I think he's the only person who knows who I was before everything became more fixed, more defined. There's a version of me that exists only with him, and I don't have that with anyone else. So when we stopped talking, it's not just that I lost contact with him, it's like that version of me just stopped having a place to exist.
You know, it's funny. You and your brother are both Italian, but English was the language you shared with your brother. Do you think that gave you a kind of distance or a kind of safety?
That's interesting. My dad's British, so that's just how we spoke at home. English felt normal between us. And then it kind of became our thing. In Trieste, it made us feel a bit different, maybe even a bit better than we were. But yeah, I think it did both. It made things easier in the sense that you weren't completely exposed. Like there was a bit of distance between what you were saying and what you actually meant. And that's helpful until it isn't. Because when something is actually important, you realise you've been speaking around it the whole time. And you don't really know how to say it properly anymore.
Looking back now, do you think you were protecting the relationship or avoiding it?
I think I told myself I was protecting it. But I was avoiding it. Which is not a great realisation to have at 35.
What changed for you after that call?
Not everything. We didn't solve anything. We didn't fix the past. But it felt less final. That's the best way I can describe it. Before, it felt like something that had ended, and now it feels like something that's still there, just not finished.
If you could say one more thing to your brother now, without overthinking it, what would it be?
I think I'd try to say something simple and not explain it. Just, hey.
There's a particular kind of silence that forms between people who care deeply about each other. Not hostile silence, not even angry silence. Just the kind built slowly out of hesitation, timing, pride, uncertainty. and the hope that maybe there will always be another opportunity to begin again later. I think many of us know that silence better than we'd like to admit. Maybe this episode reminded you of someone you haven't called. Or maybe it reminded you of a version of yourself that still exists somewhere inside another person's memory. Either way, thank you for spending this time with me. And if this story stayed with you, you can follow the podcast, share the episode with someone who might need it, or send me your own story request through my website at ifIcouldSayOneMoreThing.com. I read every submission personally. I'm Andrea Applewick, and this is If I Could Say One More Thing.